Unbabel is a LinearB customer and we've worked together. What I have seen is, and I talk with a lot of engineering teams, one of the characteristics of more, I would consider elite engineering teams or high functioning engineering teams kind of is that end-to-end responsibility, taking into account, yeah, you're going to own what you ship into production. Is that a philosophy that you had to put in from the beginning? Do you hire with that? Like, how does that permeate for you?
That was here, the company that was here when I arrived. So the company, as a startup business, the founders had spent a lot of time looking at best practice. They'd read Accelerate and they'd read all of the books about how you develop that sort of high performance. And as a startup, they had developed some fabulous services that worked and could work that way. And there's some things that we had to work on to get the services robust and resilient, and work on the deployment pipeline so that, the testing was there. Your deployment pipeline is the way you manage risk. And so we spent a lot of time just making sure those pipelines did their job. And engineers love working that way. It seems to be much more natural. Remember the days when you build software, you threw it over a friends to a QA team who sometimes threw it back. And eventually that software would find its way to production. I mean, that was, as an engineer who worked that way, that was just an inherently frustrating way of working. And then finding there was an issue in production that you weren't told about and would come to you when it had escalated. That was a hugely frustrating way of working as an engineer. And this is a much more natural way. The idea that you have control, even over the infrastructure and the resources that an application has, and you can push that out. And there's tests, all of the tests of the pipeline to ensure something is production ready to go. I mean, it is for an engineer, it's just a very natural way to work.
We've seen, even just like the happiness of engineers. If you have low cycle time and fast cycle time, and I can get my code out to production and I do have the ownership, that just feels better. So I had one job in my career as a developer where my first job out of school, I was building actually like voice recognition software. It was for Nuance, naturally speaking, also for like support agents and that kind of thing. But yeah, I worked on a project for like 6 months, which felt like it was a long time. And then it got passed over to QA and I never even know what happened to it. I actually quit within a year and joined a startup. So I don't even know if my code made it to production. I just felt like that was the oddest experience ever. And then after that, I joined a startup and we were more so on the agile. But yeah, I really, because I can see your metrics and I can appreciate all the work that you've done there. I can see it's a very, very important, I guess, tenet of your culture.
Yes. And you spoke, we've adopted LinearB. LinearB has been great. But what we didn't do was to give LinearB to the senior management team and say, now manage the engineering team. We gave it to the engineers and said, this is healthy. So now, we can see whether you're healthy or not. Just make everything green. Show us that the world is healthy. And if it's red, explain why it's red. Explain why the code reviews weren't done. And maybe it's a small team and people were out for a reason. And actually giving them the tools and saying, look, it's your job to show that you've got healthy practices, has helped the culture.
Let's dive in there a little bit. There are different tools out there that can give you metrics about your engineering people or whatever you want. What made you choose to work with our team and choose LinearB?
I think the easy things is you did a lot of the heavy lifting. So for us, we've talked for ages about, we should be measuring cycle times. We should have more information about the developer workflows, and we work in, and we have Jira to manage, to do work management and a bunch of other tools that the engineers use. And it was just easy to find a tool that's seamlessly integrated. I think we were up and running within a week or two. I spent some time with the CTO, Joe Grasson, who's a real expert in the machine translation space, looking at the results and thinking about the teams. And then we just gave it to the engineering leads who got their teams using it and started using the product stand-ups and understanding how they were doing. And the LinearB team did work with the teams to understand the tool, helped us configure the environments, helped with Slack integrations, and it was adopted seamlessly within a very short period of time.
If we're just, looking at some of the higher level numbers, you've actually had a 60% decrease in cycle time, which is pretty cool to see.
And I imagine as much as it's about LinearB, I imagine a large part of that is people just realizing they're being measured and thinking about it and remembering that cycle time is something that's quite important and just changing behavior a little bit. But it hasn't happened through any whip cracking or it happened very naturally.
So that's completely right. One thing that we see around our customer base is the concept of conversations. We're having conversations now. We're talking about these things that matter, where there's bottlenecks, within our organization, now that we can have visibility into the numbers. Have you seen that at Unbabel, the conversation starting to happen?
But not only the conversation, but I'm going to use a buzzword, psychologically safe conversations.
Yeah.
So, we try and have an environment where people can raise issues and talk about issues. Not everything goes well. Sometimes we do the wrong thing. Sometimes teams make mistakes. They don't get the planning right. And you just have a culture where someone can put their hand up and say, actually, I've got this wrong. Well, things aren't working. I need to find out why. And so you can have conversations. Why is the cycle time long? Oh, yeah. Okay. And there's no downside. Obviously, if mistakes or issues are being made repeatedly, then you need to take some action. But most engineering teams are self-correcting. If you show them how they're measured and you work with them in a psychologically safe way, they want to do a good job. And most engineering teams want to deliver something of value and do a good job and want to be seen to be doing a good job. So they will change the way they work and they will be very mindful of what they understand good is.
Absolutely. You call it psychological safety. It seems that that's kind of just built into the culture at Unbabel, but you're right. If you have that safety and everyone gets onto the same page of what is happening within engineering, we can all see it. There's the visibility. We're talking in the same language, actually going back to your, original, one of the original purposes on Babel. If we're on the same page, we're speaking the same language. Now we can have a conversation. Maybe where are the bottlenecks, or where could I use some help in my delivery pipeline? It actually seems like you have that built into the culture. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's how do we do a better job? And we all want to do a better job. We want to be world class. I don't think there's anyone who's in the industry who just doesn't want to do a good job. I think if you can inspire people to do better, then teams naturally think about how are we working. Look, our code review depth isn't as deep as it could be, and maybe that's contributing to some of the issues when we push to production. So if you have those conversations and you work with teams on the problems, teams just get better, and you build much stronger culture. We've all worked in, toxic environments where that's not the case, where you can't have those conversations, where you're expected to be perfect with every release, which as an engineer, I remember my days as an engineer, I manifestly wasn't. And you made mistakes, or you misunderstood the brief, or you didn't understand quite what the requirement, I would say user requirement. In my days as an engineer, quite often you were given a very large specification, which by the time you'd worked your way through, the world had changed and the user wasn't interested in what you built. I mean, they were the days that I learned my trade, but things are very different now. And also, Unbabel is much more of the company that, as an ambitious 25-year-old, I would have wanted to work at. I mean, it has that you turn up, you do your best, we have a culture of learning, you can make mistakes, we think about measurements, we think about great practice, and we engage the staff. We don't just tell them how you work, this is how you work. Many of the good ideas come from the engineers. Most of the good, pretty much all of the good ideas come from the engineers. And then there's a bottom-up groundswell to the culture.
That's the perfect way, I think, to see improvement, and you're totally embracing it. You mentioned, for example, review depth, and for our listeners, review depth relates to how much feedback is a developer getting on their pull requests in terms of comments. In terms of the metrics that you care about on Babel, how are you approaching it? So, what metrics do you look at? And is it more of guidance from you as the VP of engineering, or is it kind of like, here's the guidance and team leaders, kind of each one of you are responsible? Like, how do you approach the metrics?
The metrics get pushed out. So it's up to the engineering leads to know that they're running a healthy team.
Yep.
feel accountable for the way that their teams work. And what are the metrics that we're interested in? Obviously, the cycle times, which just are great. We just, how big is the MR? How big is the change that you're making? Because if you're making huge changes, we have problems. You're doing too much work without checking it in. And, we do small changes often results in a better product. We look at the amount of rework against new work.
Okay.
And there are times when you are reworking code. And there are times when that happens, but just making sure that we expect what we're seeing and the teams have a healthy amount of new work. We're making some progress. We're doing some new things rather than just going over old code and dealing with issues in the old code. So there are lots of things. We look at the code review cycles, how quickly our changes picked up for that peer review, because we know that's important. And are those peer reviews happening? And is everybody doing peer reviews? And just making sure that those things are happening means that I get a bit more sleep at night, that the product, when it gets pushed to production, is in the right state.
Yeah. The peer reviews, the pull request process, it's such a collaborative process. It's a social process. We have a lot of engineers that are now working remote, or you might have people all over the world. And one of the investment areas that we've done within LinearB is what we call our Worker Bee feature. So, essentially what Worker Bee is this kind of intelligent bot that each engineer either can turn on themselves, or you can turn it on at a team level, and it provides awareness on pull requests. Hey, someone's waiting for you, or here's how long it's going to take to review this code. Maybe you should start it after your meeting so you can finish it end to end. How have those Worker Bee team policies been used at Unbabel?
They've been used. I mean, we couple them with good rituals. Software engineering is still a very social process. To have it done well, the team need to talk together. They need to understand what they're waiting on. We have lots of dependencies by team. So we have a lot of small teams, but they have if you imagine what we have is a great big pipeline, and the change that one team makes is going to impact people down the pipeline. And so the dependencies between teams are quite significant. And we also work in a way where we have teams that are very much focused on the translation process. And then we have another set of teams that translate that translation process for each of the use cases that we're targeting, or provide reports and information for our customers. So we have two very different styles of working with fundamental dependencies, which we try and contractualize through APIs in a fairly established way. But there needs to be a lot of social communication within the team and good, strong rituals, and also in the planning process and the understanding of dependencies between the teams. So the Worker Bee stuff absolutely supports that and contributes to it. But and as great as LinearB is, without those rituals and without being played into those conversations, then it's not going to work. So together with the rituals, together with the conversations, the socialization of change, so people know what's happening in the business, and it works very well.
It always has to be that combination. And I appreciate you, taking a little time to talk about LinearB, and we're really just a catalyst of what you've already been doing and helping with those conversations and the culture.